Dr. Dudley Lamming is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where his lab discovered that low-protein diets promote metabolic health, improving blood sugar control and reducing adiposity in humans and mice, and has identified dietary branch-chain amino acids as key regulators of these effects. And with that, let me start the interview. Hello, Dr. Lamming. You are a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where you run a lab studying the molecular physiology of aging. So thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to Modern Healthspan.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Professor Lamming, could you provide a brief introduction to the key areas of your lab and the studies that you're doing?
Sure. Put simply, we're really interested in how what, when, and how much you eat controls healthy aging. And so we're really focused pretty heavily on understanding the role of dietary protein and specific amino acids in the response and in the response to protein restriction, which is basically the observation that contrary to a lot of modern diet advice, that when you lower protein consumption in a human or a mouse, it tends to be associated with better metabolic health, lower rates of age-related diseases, and in animals, at least, increased longevity.
Excellent.
Other work ongoing in the lab is looking at calorie restriction and how eating patterns tend to regulate health.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I kind of wanted to start at the top, which is like calorie restriction, and then kind of work down into the more detail.
Sure.
So I did. So calorie restriction is famously like the gold standard, but I did see that you did a paper where you looked at like calorie restriction kind of requires fasting as well for its effect to work. Could you talk a little bit about what you saw in that and like how long are the fasts?
Sure. So calorie restriction not only is the gold standard, it's also famously hard to understand, because when we talk about calorie restriction, of course, you're changing the levels of all the different dietary macronutrients at once. You might also be affecting levels of micronutrients. And one of the things that we realized is that you're also affecting eating pattern. And so this is something that people have known for a really long time. When rodents in the laboratory are placed on calorie restriction studies, they're usually fed once per day. And a lot of attention has focused in the past on whether it matters whether you feed them in the night or in the morning. Overall, it tends not to matter that much, but there may definitely be some effects. But mice get hungry when they're on calorie restriction. Humans get hungry when they're on calorie restriction too. And so when you feed them one meal a day, a mouse will eat its food in about 2 hours, maybe 3. And so for the remainder of that day, 21, 22 hours, the mouse is fasting. And so what we realized, what Heidi Pack, a graduate student in our lab, realized, was that in addition to restricting energy intake, we're also imposing this fasting period on the mice. And a variety of work by other groups has suggested that time-restricted feeding, which you're probably familiar with and your audience has probably heard something about as well, might have beneficial effects on health based on both mouse studies and studies in humans. And so we really wanted to understand if this fasting period contributed to the effects of calorie restriction. And the long and short of it was that it does. So we took mice and placed them on various different feeding regimens. Some mice got a conventional CR diet where they got fed once a day. Other mice got fed using a fish feeder to drop food into their cages at various times to lengthen the period where they were consuming food. And some mice got a diet that was diluted with cellulose. So they could eat as much as they wanted to, but they didn't absorb as much energy from it. And what we found there was that fasting period seems to be required for the beneficial metabolic effects of calorie restriction, and also the effects of calorie restriction on longevity, frailty, and maybe even memory. And so it seems like that fasting period is very important. And I think overall that brings up an important point, right? When humans are on calorie restriction, very often, historically speaking at least, they've been eating something like 3 meals a day. But that may or may not be the healthiest eating pattern for a human who's restricting calories. And although we didn't look at the effects on lifespan yet, what we found was that fasting alone if you ate a normal amount of food in a very confined time period as a mouse, so you ate a whole day's worth of food in about 3 hours, that actually seems to reproduce the metabolic and molecular effects of CR. And so maybe, fasting and sort of intermittent fasting where you would only eat for a very short time period of day, maybe that could have beneficial effects. Again, sort of remains to be seen in humans. Some of this is very difficult due to the fact that, of course, we can decide to go and eat various other foods or, eat at other times of day. And so it definitely remains to be seen. But definitely that fasting period seems to be very important for the effects of CR.
But if we thought about that, I mean, like 21 hours for a mouse is like a long time to be fasting. So would this imply that for humans, it would need to be like multi-days to get the same benefit?
That's a very interesting question. And it's very difficult to compare the fasting period in a mouse and a fasting period to a human. As you said, right, typically speaking, some of the molecular effects of fasting that we see in a human might take several days or even a week to occur versus just an overnight period for a mouse. But that's not true for everything. That's true for some things. And so I think that's an unanswered question that needs to be addressed as we sort of move these types of studies forward.
Kind of moving down one layer. So then you're looking at protein restriction. So leaving, I guess, carbs and fat, but restricting protein. Can you talk a little bit about what we've seen for protein restriction? What kind of benefits does that provide?
Sure. So protein restriction has sort of a varied history, and particularly in rodent studies, some of the very early studies showed that protein restriction had some beneficial effects. Then some later studies suggested that might not be true. And in retrospect, we think that probably that was due to the fact that they were using very different levels of protein in the diet in their different studies, and also different protein sources. So the composition of the protein seems to matter a lot. But we started looking this again in around 2014, following Steve Simpson's laboratory in Australia, finding that when you fed mice a variety of diets, the ones that lived the longest were the ones that ate a low protein diet. And we were really interested in that. It turns out that from a human standpoint, a lot of epidemiological studies have been done looking at dietary macronutrient intake and the effects on things like cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. And when you look across these studies, one thing that pops out is that all of these studies show that the more protein you eat, the higher the risk of diabetes. And of course, nutritional studies and epidemiological studies have their problems, but overall, they're good from one perspective, which is that they follow very large numbers for a long period of time. And so some of these studies are following 10,000, 40,000 people for a decade or more. And so it seems like pretty solid suggestive evidence that there might be a link between diabetes and protein, and maybe other diseases of aging as well. From the human standpoint, Luigi Fontana's laboratory at Washington University in St. Louis did a human study of protein restriction, and we looked at metabolic outcomes with him in that study. And so what we found was that just a very short-term protein restricted diet, where people ate about 7 to 9% of their calories from protein versus about 17% in the control group, that in just 6 weeks caused people to lose weight, particularly fat mass, and their fasting blood glucose levels went down as well. And so it seems like there's definitely some promising effects of protein restriction. And since that time, we and a number of other labs have shown that protein restriction in mice extends lifespan, extends Healthspan, keeps mice fit. They don't get frail, which is one thing that you might worry about if you're cutting back on dietary protein. And they're much metabolically healthier. So they have better control of blood glucose levels. They have better insulin sensitivity.
In Dr. Fontana's study, do you know what the kind of mix of fat and carbohydrate was? Because you've only got 7% protein.
So one of the problems with human studies overall is that is exactly what you're saying, right? So if you're feeding people natural foods, you're changing a lot of things at once. And so people were going from, eating larger meals where they contain or large meals that contain, a lot of meat to meals that would contain more vegetables, more fish, etc. And so the composition of those diets is very different. And so that's one potential issue. One of the reasons that mice are so great is that we don't have that limitation. So in all of our studies where we restrict dietary protein, we keep the fat sources exactly consistent. Usually we switch to a low protein, high carbohydrate diet. But then we'll talk later about some of our amino acid studies. In those studies, we can actually increase non-essential amino acids so that everything is isonitrogenous. The carbohydrates are exactly the same as well. And so that's a real advantage of a mouse study versus a human study where you're changing everything about the food in order to cut protein.